Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another installment of the Great Minds series. This evening, we're embarking on the voyage into the vast oceans of the mind, guided by two of the finest navigators in the field of consciousness. First, we have Professor Anil Seth from the University of Sussex, a leading neuroscientist co-directing the Sackler Centre of Consciousness Science. Professor Seth's groundbreaking research spanned neuroscience, mathematics, and philosophy, with a keen focus on how our brain constructs reality, a process he described as control hallucinations. Joining him is Professor Christof Koch, Chief Scientist at the Allen Institute of the Brain Science, whose pioneering work has been instrumental in advancing our understanding of consciousness through the lens of integrated information theory, or IIT. Together, they are set to enrich our understanding, not in debate, but in a dialogue, exploring the profound mystery of consciousness. Let's dive in.
Thank you very much, Ivy. I should note I stepped down from all executive duties at the Allen Institute for Brain Science. I'm now just a regular neuroscientist, but I am also the chief scientist of the Tiny Blue Dot Foundation in Santa Monica. So I thought we can just start off this dialogue with Anil by reading. So my book just came out a couple of days ago. The title is "Then I Am Myself, the World." Then I Am Myself, the World, taken from Tristan and Isolde, the opera by Wagner. And I thought I'd just read the opening page of this book, because that'll get us right into the stuff, the beating heart of it. Within seconds, my entire field of view became engulfed by dark, swirling smoke. The space around me fractured into 1,000 hexagons and shattered. The speed with which this happened left no time to regret the situation I got myself into. As I was sucked into a black hole, my last thought was that with the dying of the light, I too would die. And I did. I ceased to exist in any recognizable way, shape, or form. No more Christof, no more ego, no more self, no memories, dreams, desires, hopes, fears. Everything personal was stripped away. Nothing was left but a non-self. This remaining essence wasn't man, woman, child, animal, spirit, or anything else. It didn't want anything, expect anything, think anything, remember anything, dread anything. But it did experience. Boy, did it ever. It saw a point of cold, white light of unbearable intensity, unable even to conceive of looking away, as there was no away from. There was no left or right, no up or down, front or back, far away or close by. There wasn't a black canvas upon which the light existed, as there was no space. There were no other attributes, no color, no motion, no texture, no sound or silence, no smell, no body, no pleasure, no pain. What there was a timeless universe convulsed to a blazing icy light. That, and a profound feeling of both terror and ecstasy, the awfulness of pure experience lasting indefinitely, for there was no perception of time. The experience wasn't too brief or too long, it simply was. So, Anil, what do you think about, I mean, I'm sure, I don't know whether you yourself may have had something like that, but surely you've had other people describe experiences very similar, or at least qualitatively very similar to this type of experience. So you take them, what do you think about them?
I think it's a beautifully written description of something that's really hard to describe. When it comes to writing about the range of possible conscious experiences that we can have, I think actually science does pretty badly. Literature often does a lot better. And actually that's part of the problem in studying consciousness, is we tend to oversimplify the explanatory target. And so to be able to describe a very unusual experience like that, I think it's a real contribution, a real gift. Yes, I've read and had described similar things and have had a similar experience myself. I take experiences like these. Just by the way, would you have described this as a ego dissolution, or as a near-death experience, or as some combination of the two, or are those labels inadequate for you about?
No, I mean, it's certainly ego. There's no self. I mean, there was no, This is, by the way, where I think higher order thought theories don't cut it. At this point, there was no self, no Christof, no memory, no body, no world. But yet, whatever was highly conscious. So it's certainly a complete ego dissolution.
Yes. So this is, Fantastic. So I think what experiences like this can tell us is they can reveal to us things that we might have assumed to be necessary aspects of consciousness turn out to be contingent aspects, specific ways in which human experience normally is, that are so pervasive that it becomes, without having an insight like this, almost impossible to conceive of there being an alternative. And the presence of a kind of experiencing self as part of the ongoing flow of experience is one aspect of that, the ego. We're so used to experiencing ourselves as the subject of experience that it's tending to reify it, to take it as essential, when it is in fact not essential. And it may not just be humans in strange conditions, whether it's near-death experiences or on doses of heroic doses of psychedelics or whatever it might be. It could be newborn infants, it could be non-human animals. There may be other conscious creatures that also have a very different way of being in the world that confounds our anthropocentric view of things. So that's one thing. I think it tells us that when we're trying to explain consciousness, we must be careful to distinguish what is essential and necessary, axiomatic, which I'm sure we'll get onto, from what is contingent. The other thing, though, and this is where maybe we're going to have a bit of a disagreement, is that the experience itself doesn't necessarily give you any insight into what is. And I think it can tell us what is not necessary, but it doesn't necessarily reveal any truths about the causal underpinnings of consciousness. So for instance, some people after a psychedelic experience will take this as evidence for the immateriality of consciousness because they've experienced themselves leaving their body or being without a body in some ways. So that can be interpreted as sort of first-person evidence that consciousness is immaterial. And I think that's a mistake. It's a confusion of what Quine used to call the manifest image, the things as they appear with things as they are. So it's a combination of these two perspectives. These experiences reveal a lot about the space of possible conscious experiences, and of course, how they might come about. It depends on what gave rise to that particular experience you're describing, the DMT or something else. And but also, I think we've got to be careful to avoid taking it as a reliable insight into how things actually really are.
Okay, so can I press back on that, on this latter point? Otherwise, I totally agree with you. So William James, famously in Varieties of Religious Experiences, right, talks about this noetic quality that people bring back from their what he called religious experience, which is broadly construed, aesthetic experiences, mystical experience, near-death experiences, religious conversion experiences. I think they all involve ego dissolution, and they're all in very, very meaningful. So you bring back something noetic. Now, he emphasizes other people don't have to be convinced of that noetic, right? So you don't have to. But for the experiencer themselves, it is very, very difficult not to take some ontic knowledge from that about what truly exists. And you can certainly be highly motivated by such experiences that people have to begin to doubt the standard metaphysics we've all been raised on, i.e., which is sort of a blind faith in pure or naive or classical physicalism. Mm-hmm. So I think if you have such an experience, it leaves you. So I had a totally separate experience. We don't need to go into it, which was a mystical experience, which left me completely perplexed. I'm still perplexed. This happened a year and a half ago in Brazil, where you encounter something that feels like just a different reality altogether. Now, I'm still a scientist, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'm still trying to reconcile that. But certainly what it has led to, and I think that it's legit, to a crack in my ontological foundation, which at my age, I'm 67 now, typically is very well formed, right? By my age, you really know what you believe and you know what you don't know, and you know what you do know. But then now there is this earthquake that I experience, which leaves me puzzling, which leaves me questioning standard physicalist ontology?
I mean, well, the first thing is, I mean, one thing I think that's particularly fascinating about you as a neuroscientist in this area is that you're one of the few people who has actually changed their mind already once in their career, quite dramatically. And I think we're going to hopefully talk about this more. I mean, when I first got to know you, you were a champion of the neural correlates of consciousness approach, which is a very pragmatic, extremely productive, and I think historically very appropriate stance to take on let's not worry too much about the metaphysics. Let's just we know the brain is intimately related to consciousness, so let's figure out how that is. What are the bridging principles? Which basically just says, okay, let's just assume materialism and run with it and see what happens, because we can build these relationships. And then you change to become a protagonist of integrated information theory, which has its own interesting and slightly weird metaphysics, which I want to ask you about later. So anyway, that's just to say, I think it is rare that people can change their whole ontological foundations, but maybe it's less unexpected coming from you, because you've shown a surprising flexibility in this already. But back to the specific point. I mean, for me, I just think the questions about ontology and metaphysics are just independent questions, and the content of any particular experience doesn't provide evidence one way or the other. The fact that I might experience the being in an alternative universe or experience myself far from my body or something, to me just tells me that whatever is responsible for conscious experience, well, that's a point in the possible space of experiences. It doesn't necessarily give me any evidence about how reality really is, whether it's composed of matter, whatever that might be, or whether it's composed of atoms of consciousness or something else in some kind of monism. So I just... maybe I'd change my mind if I had a particular experience. Maybe there's an experience out there that I haven't had that would shake my ontological foundations. But the fact is, I feel relatively agnostic about those. No. I feel kind of agnostic about those foundations anyway, in the sense that, I think materialism has served very well. I think it's radically underestimated in the sense that matter is very complicated and we don't really understand matter. So to sort of put limits on what matter might be capable of explaining, I think short-changes materialism. But it's pragmatically, I think, a very useful strategy, because for the standard philosophy of science reasons, it's not itself testable, but it's highly productive in the sort of philosophy of science sense of Imre Lakatos, that it leads us to develop hypotheses that have predictive and explanatory power. Now, there may be limits on materialism in the end, and we may realize that there's still something left over. Here, I'm a little bit sympathetic to a kind of weak illusionism, where we may realize that the what's left over is just is an aspect of how we're misasking the questions rather than
I couldn't disagree more. Okay, so three things. So historically, you say physicalism has aligned, or materialism. I mean, physicalism is really materialism for the 21st century, right? Because it includes dark matter and dark energy that isn't really standard matter anymore. Anyhow, we can use them interchangeable. And it's true, historically, it has aligned with the progress in science has aligned with the belief in physicalism. But that's almost like an accident. That's for sociological reasons. Some of the fathers of enlightenment, Newton, Galileo, right? They were both devout people, and they set aside their beliefs to formulate, famously Newton and Galileo's theory of gravity, etc. So it's simply not true that progress in science depends on materialism. As you said, you can be just simply neutral about the underlying stuff, and you just manipulate things and predict things. That's enormously successful. But the two challenges that physicalism has, or materialism has, utterly failed to address is consciousness. saying it's an illusion simply doesn't cut it for me. You know, saying you're not really in pain, you're confused, all there is behavioral disposition, but you're simply not in pain. This is gaslighting. It's trying to cancel consciousness. Okay, and it hasn't
Now
failed.
you're being provocative, yeah.
Well, yes, but it also, people don't suddenly say, oh, you're right, it's an illusion, that's it. No one talks about consciousness anymore. How many philosophy departments have shut down because they say, oh, the answer is clear, it's all illusion, there's nothing to see here, folks, move on, nothing to see here, hasn't happened. B, when it really comes, so I work a lot with quantum physicists. I hang out with, we talked about it, and what you see there, we are very good at manipulating quantum states now. People are building quantum computers, but we have no idea what actually happens, right? And we have these weird Bell entangled states where, you can have you can have a pair of, photons or something, opposite spin, they're half a universe away, and they're still coupled. Well, is that really what people mean by physicalism, that non-locality goes out of the way? So I think at the top, we failed to physicalism has failed to explain consciousness. At the bottom, we don't really know what the physical is. So it seems to me that's a massive crisis, and we give out Nobel prizes for this, right? Yet I think standard physicalism has so much inertia behind it because all these institutions are built on it, and if you question it, I've already experienced this now over the last half year. When you begin to question it a little bit, people say, "Well, you're totally crazy. You're woo-woo. You're going over. Next thing you'll believe in astrology," which is, is completely BS. So
we'll talk again in another 10 years and see see what you're defending at that point.
A case of wine, maybe.
I think that would be a safe win for Christof. Okay, yeah, all right. So, I mean, I agree with you in the sense that what you're insinuating as being standard materialism sort of is like just artificial neural networks in biological form or something like that. Something very simple, neurons interacting with each other through
no
links.
Not simple. No, it can be. Look, I'm surrounded by neuroscientists. We study the brain all the time. It is by far the most complex piece of matter anyone has ever studied. There's no question about it. But when it's confronted with and it's incredible, quantum mechanics works very well. In fact, there's a school of ontology in quantum mechanics that says, shut up and calculate, right? Don't worry about all the details, just calculate. So there's no question matter is amazingly complex, has given rise to evolution and to us. I don't doubt any of that. Yeah. But when I do doubt when people tell me, oh, we understand the world is all there is physicalism, and it's very clear how things like mind emerge, and when that's simply not the case, and we don't know what physicalism is at the bottom.
No, so I mean, I think I'm okay with both of those points. I think it's premature to claim that we understand consciousness in terms of physical stuff. I don't think any theory of consciousness, materialist or otherwise, is really up to the job. Doesn't mean it can't or won't happen. I go back to the parallel with vitalism, historical parallel with vitalism. People thought life was not explicable in terms of physics and chemistry, and pretty much turned out to be wrong about that. But from that particular point in time, with the tools and the concepts that were available then, it just seemed like there had to be something extra. There had to be something different. And it seems to me that it's premature to rule out that we're historically in a similar phase now, and that as materialism develops, and as it develops, by the way, in a way that really does embrace the complexity and weirdness of matter at its more fundamental levels, then I think it's an open question whether we will need to do that in order to come up with a satisfactory account of consciousness. But it would still be a physicalist one. So I think physicalism has ways to go. It's not there yet. It's not obviously going to succeed, but it's not necessarily going to fail. And it may well require a kind of widening of the view to realize that matter is very complicated. And it's shut up and calculate is I think one of the tragedies of modern physics. It's got very exciting again now that people are talking about foundations of quantum mechanics more seriously, even though it's still frustrating that there's no way really to arbitrate the different ones. But just back to where we started, I think you can reasonably argue that physicalism may not be up to the job because it just doesn't seem to be the kind of framework that could deliver an explanation. But why in the world is your strange experience any evidence for this one way or the other?
I can only repeat William James. It's not for you, but it is for me. It is this noetic quality that people bring back. I encountered something that, it's like Huxley talking about mind at large in the mescaline when he talks in The Doors of Perception. I encountered something that leaves me totally perplexed, where I have the feeling maybe ultimately everything is mental, much closer to analytic idealism as Schopenhauer, and now, of course, in modern form, and Bernardo Kastrup. And then he makes this argument, I haven't seen it in Schopenhauer, but he makes it very clear. The idealism is actually a more simpler assumption than physicalism, because physicalism struggles, I think it's fair to say right now, to account for the mental, and says, well, we can't account it, maybe it's an illusion. But the only thing I have directly access to, and you have directly access to, and every scientist has access to, right? And Schrödinger emphasized that is qualia, is qualitative states, right? I see a gauge, I read a number of, some instruments. So ultimately, all I have access is a phenomenal. And isn't then the easiest to say, well, it's not just so there's phenomenal, everything is phenomenal to the horizon. Well, isn't it then easiest to say, well, everything is phenomenal, not only to the horizon, but everything. And the physical ultimately is some sort of mental manifestation. Then I don't need to postulate then I don't get into this difficulty. I just say, well, everything is mental.
I mean, it's easy to say that. Of course, it's easy to say that, but it doesn't mean it's right. And, I think there's a confusion there between, there's a kind of direct epistemological access we have to consciousness, which is a distinctive thing about it, right? So, as you say, the only thing, ultimately, all we have access to are conscious experiences. And so, and I agree with that. So I'm not trying to gaslight through illusionism here and anything like that. I think I think what would be described as phenomenal realist. I think conscious experiences exist. But the fact that they have this particular property wherein we have an epistemological acquaintance with them, and I think philosophers might disagree with this about this, but there's something special in terms of the kind of acquaintance we have with qualia. That doesn't imply, to me anyway, it doesn't imply anything about their ontological nature. We can have that. That just means that they make it a particularly difficult thing to study because the most direct information we have about them is subjective and is private, and that's problematic.
Why is it problematic? This is just the case. Why, in fact, isn't the shoe on the other foot? You postulate, in the extreme case, I could say you postulate these extra things called physical things, okay, that I personally have never experienced. I've never experienced an atom or a black hole.
Yeah.
So isn't it more natural just to say, no, all there is pain and pleasure and heat and warm and cold and, pain, all of those things.
Yeah, but I think then that discounts what the scientific method has allowed us to do over centuries, because it's precisely by postulating the existence of things that we don't have direct access to, that exist independently of us and exist independently of our experience, has given us such insight into the universe.
I hear you, but idealism does not deny that. I mean, Bernardo Kastrup is very certain there is an external world that I don't directly control, no matter what I want or wish for. There are things that are outside of me. Right. That I can control. There are also other minds that I don't have access to, which is the challenge that that idealism has to account for, right? If it's all one mind, why don't I access your mind? But as long as you believe in an external world, as long as you're not a solipsist, that's all in my mind, I think you're okay. And you can do, as far as I see it, I can do all the science I do, continue to do in my lab, write grants, do inject currents, do optogenetics, do all that things. But I don't have to be, metaphysically speaking, a physicalist. I can still, it's sane to me, or it's rational to assume, ultimately it's all a manifestation of something mental.
Does it help you in any way, though? I mean, if it makes no difference to your scientific practice, then what's the advantage? Because it does seem
It helps explain my personal experience, which is, which I want to do. I understand you don't want to do, but this is what I want to do. It helps explain the phenomenon of consciousness. It's simply fundamental. And it also gets rid of the problem of matter, this weird at the foundational level, trying to understand how things can interact across, vast distances. If it's all part of some sort of mental mind, then yes, this may well be compatible with that. I agree. I mean, I totally agree with you, Anil. You can't prove a metaphysics. It's just, is it a simple explanatory framework to explain everything that we know?
Well, okay, so that's one criteria, and some metaphysical frameworks can address that criteria quite nicely. Some forms of idealism, maybe panpsychism also as well. You just postulate things, but that's only one criteria. The other criteria, I think, are what new things can we learn by just keeping a particular metaphysical perspective in the background. Come back to a very obvious example, which is something you work on as well, which is general anesthesia. And general anesthesia is interesting because it knocks out consciousness. At least that's the reason we tend to assume it's interesting, because here we have a human being in a particular state, and then we administer this chemical, and that human being no longer has any subjective experience going on until a certain point in time later. So there's still something existing in the universe. There's still something that corresponds to this human being and their brain. Yet the consciousness associated with that person has been altered. It is present, it is absent, it is present again. Now, it seems more parsimonious to me to think of this in terms of broadly a physicalist term, that there's something happening to the brain body which is manipulating or responsible for the interruption in the property of consciousness, rather than the other way around, to say that, well, everything is mental, so this brain-body thing is still a form of consciousness somehow, but it's somehow now existing in a form of consciousness that doesn't aggregate into a conscious experience of the...
I wouldn't use that language, Anil. I would say the brain is it's an external manifestation. I mean, one could say, I'm not quite there yet, but for the sake of argument, you could say, no, the brain is an external manifestation, but it's external to me, and I can manipulate it experimentally. So I can put in anesthesia, I can track what channel it interacts with, what GABA, glycine, et cetera, channel. I can do all of the science, and I can publish on this without any problem. For me, it's just ultimately the brain, as including my brain, including everything else, may well just all be external manifestation of an entity that's fundamental mental. Phenomenal. So, really Schopenhauer.
So there's an entity, a fundamental entity. I mean, this is beginning to sound a little bit religious as well, that is something that's appealing to you about this, that there's some, global coherence, unity to this. You said in something earlier that just struck me, which was that, long distance entanglement becomes not a problem if it's part of some whole mind. Is that there in the background?
Well, it doesn't have to. I mean, so if you follow Schopenhauer, right? Who was, of course, profoundly atheist. I mean, non-Christian. In fact, he got into trouble for that. He at some point he had to stop writing because of that. In his case, ultimately, everything is this manifestation of what he calls the will, this instinctual mental entity that constitutes everything, the entire universe, everything in it, including, stars and people. It may not have a very sophisticated mind, this thing. It may be just have some very simple states, just of, instinctual states almost, out of which arises everything. To me, I don't see how I could disprove that.
Okay. Well, I think we agree these things are not amenable to experimental disproof, right? I think that's reasonable. It's more, I think there's the case of explanatory reach and predictive power. And for you, idealism seems to have more explanatory power because of, in part, this distinctive experience that you've had. Is that fair?
I'm beginning to explore. So I grew up with Schopenhauer. I read him, and then I never read him for the last 40 years, and now I'm coming back to or modern versions like Bernardo Castro's, where I partly in debates with people such as yourself, who are very articulate and who can push back. I'm trying to sort of explore to what extent something like that is compatible with everything. I want to explain all the scientific facts that I know, including NCCs, right? Of course, neural correlates of consciousness. But I also want to explain my personal experience. And I want to see how it deals with consciousness and how it ultimately deals with things at the bottom, with sort of quantum reality. And
let me ask you another question. Just to try and understand the reasoning a little bit differently. So, instead of the complete annihilation of ego dissolution that you described beautifully in the opening of your new book, a lot of people, and you may have had this as part of this experience or another experience, have out-of-body experiences where they experience that their mind has left their body, or their seat of consciousness has left their body and gone flying around somewhere, and perhaps they see their body from a different point in space, or perhaps they don't, and they just feel that they've left it and outside their body in some ways. So there's a very strong phenomenality here, seeming to indicate that consciousness is not tied to the body, that it can be separate from the body. That's why people find these experiences so transformational and compelling. Now, there are two ways to interpret an experience like that. The first is that, oh yeah, that's really good evidence that my consciousness can be separated from my brain and body and go flying around. And this is good extra evidence for the reality of what seems to be the case in an out-of-body experience. Of course, the other way of accounting for it is to say, look, this is really interesting because what it reveals is that the sense of seeing things from a particular perspective is something the brain is always on the fly constructing, and it does so in a way that it's normally constructing a first-person perspective from where the head is. But in some situations, that process can go wrong. And they're both compatible with the subjective, the first-person data. But I would contend that one is more on the right track than the other, and probably more predictive as well. From a certain one thing you can predict is okay, well, if I do this to the brain, then I can get an out-of-body experience. And if I stop doing this, then it'll stop, which of course has famously been done in certain brain stimulation experiments. And so my question to you is whether you agree that those two ways of accounting for, or what do you think about those two ways of accounting for out-of-body experiences? And it seems to me that a similar reasoning applies to your ego death experience, that to take the experience as face value. It's like I often say we should take these experiences seriously, but not literally. They have great meaning. They have, as you say, noetic power. But it doesn't mean that what they seem to be conveying is what they actually are conveying.
Okay, so you made a very good argument. I like that. That's really a very good argument. I have to think about that. Yes, I think both explanations are compatible with so I've never had an out-of-body experience, but like you, I know lots of people who have, and I believe the experience, and there are two interpretations. I am with you. I have difficulty to believe that, the mind somehow has access now to other places and can travel around. I agree. I'm with you there. That's true. Now with ego death, so this experience with which I start the book it wasn't a mystical experience. It's just an experience of profound ego loss. Mm-hmm. And what it taught me is exactly what you said, that you don't need a sense of self. That sense of self is not necessary to have a conscious experience. Yeah. I'm talking about the second experience I had independently and in a very different condition, in a very different place, mm-hmm. where I felt I accessed this, what Huxley called the mind at large, where I felt, mm-hmm. I'm one with the entire universe, and ultimately everything is mental. And I know it sounds very woo-woo and all of that, but I'm trying to
only
I
sounds
bring back this
woo-woo.
knowledge.
It's fine. It only sounds woo-woo if you take it as an insight into the nature of reality. If you take it as an insight into the range of possible experiences and what a good theory of consciousness ought to be able to account for, then I think it's extremely valuable and informative. But yeah, I mean, it's just, I mean, we don't have to get to the bottom of this now, but I am honestly interested in, I think the same reasoning applies as for the out-of-body experience, that if you take the experience literally, then you might go down the wrong path about concluding how reality really works in terms of souls flying about. But if you take it as informative about the contingent versus necessary aspects of experience, it can be extremely, extremely useful.
I hear you, but I guess this coincides with my feeling, although, having been a practicing card-carrying physicalist for my entire life, and it works very well for most things that we study in the lab. There's no question about it. As I said, those two, consciousness and at the bottom, it really has big challenges. And maybe we should just leave it at that. And people realize both. I mean, lots of people are trying to meet both the physicalist trying to explain consciousness challenge and the quantum mechanical challenges. Although by latest count, there are 18 different interpretations of quantum mechanics on Wikipedia and probably many more around. So we're not going to come to an answer anytime soon.
No, by the way, I think just as maybe this is going to move us on a little bit now. I mean, I think that I've been really pleased to hear that you're working a little bit in quantum mechanics and consciousness now, because I do think one of the unfortunate historical it's not quite a tragedy, but one of the unfortunate historical features of our field is that people got put off from speaking about quantum mechanics at all because of the initial way these ideas were presented in places like The Emperor's New Mind by Roger Penrose. He's a brilliant man and a really lovely guy and a foundational mathematician and physicist. But the treatment of consciousness, and I remember reading that book when I was 17 and just starting out studying physics at Cambridge, and it almost put me off entirely. I was kind of confused and despondent.
Really? Huh.
After reading The Emperor's New Mind, yeah.
It's beautiful written. This was
maybe I was too young. I don't know.
86, right?
I think so. Yeah, I read it in 1990 when I don't think I would have been able to face it when I was 14. So,
oh wait, and then there's the Shadows of the Mind, right? His second book.
Yeah, that was the second book. I think it was 1980. It was late 1980s when it came out. Anyways, for whatever reason, and then there was this, the Orc-OR hypothesis. For various reasons, it's been rather taboo to speak about quantum mechanics in the context of consciousness research. And it's not like I've had a Damascene conversion and believe that, that consciousness is in, as Stuart Hameroff might say, in the microtubules or something like that. I don't, I'm nothing like that. It's more to the point that materialism, physicalism is a rich set of resources, and there are very strange things happening at the world of at the more fundamental levels of reality that may or may not be necessary. I mean, we already know that quantum physics is necessary to account for some features in biology. This is in a metaphysically non-mysterious way. Things like photosynthesis. To explain the efficiency of photosynthesis, you need to appeal to quantum tunneling effects. Perhaps to explain how anesthetics work, you will need the same thing. You're doing an experiment now, which I think is testing that idea. That's going to be great, but it doesn't fundamentally speak to the metaphysics, right? It just means that there's some process going on at the quantum level that we need to appeal to. I mean, we couldn't have computers without quantum effects. Nothing spooky about that whatsoever. So I think this is quite a good thing. And what I would like to see in general is a bit of a détente where ideas connecting quantum biology to consciousness are not immediately slung out into the garbage, but tested for what predictive and explanatory power they actually have. Just to finish this line of thought, I mean, one study that's still very much in the planning stage that I was surprised to get involved with, the idea of one of my former postdocs, Yaya Pinto, is to figure out an experimental test of the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation. So the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation, for people listening, is the interpretation in quantum physics wherein it's consciousness that collapses the wave function. So everything exists in a superposition until it's consciously experienced, and then it becomes definite. And this is basically, there's no reason to think why this might be the case. It's not been one of the favored interpretations in quantum mechanics. But no one's actually put it to the test, and there might be ways to do that. We're not the only people thinking about this. There are lots of other people thinking about how you might psychophysically manipulate the conscious status of an observation and see what happens to a measurement in something like a double slit experiment. So I'm quite keen on
how do you do this in people? Is this done in people, or what's the outline of the
I mean, the conceptual idea is fairly straightforward, that you have something like a double slit experiment where you have a single quantum particle that goes through two slits, and if you put a detector at a board behind the two slits, you see an interference pattern, as if the particle has gone through both slits simultaneously and interfered with itself, and you get an interference pattern build up. But if you put detectors where the slits are, it goes only through one, and you just see build up sort of beneath both of the two slits. So it's simply to think, well, can we just, I don't know, have some situation where that observation, let's say at the detector, is consciously or unconsciously perceived in some way, and if you have to do various things to match times
with a single photon. Is the idea a single photon, like Ali Pasha?
Yeah, I think so. I've forgotten. Well, I was never fully acquainted with the details. But conceptually, the idea that might be possible to do something like this was quite appealing to me. It got it got much more complicated very quickly, and went way out of my wheelhouse in terms of, it basically became something about Bell inequalities as well, that you'd be predicting the ratios of things that you might observe on the logic that things remain entangled until they're observed, and you can sort of break the entanglement by observing consciously or unconsciously according to von Neumann Wigner, and that would change the ratios of things. But yeah, I would struggle. I don't want to outstrip my familiarity with what we were talking about. But I just like the idea that things like this could be a little bit on the table again.
Yeah, I mean, I think I totally agree with you. That's why I'm also involved in these. I think if I were a betting man, I would give it low chances.
Yeah.
But the great thing about science is, right, whether you're materialist and idealist, the great thing about science is you can ask nature a question, and if you ask it the right way, right, with right statistics, you get an answer, and then you know. Agreed.
Exactly. I'm glad. So we definitely agree on that.
And quantum mechanics does have this nice feature. It's definite, right? So you can say, yes, it collapses, and then there's only this one state. So any experience would be a classic, right? Would be definite. And also it solves for you the binding problem, right? Particularly if you include entanglement, right? If you think, you have a quantum system that has so many entangled bits, then they by definition, they're entangled. They solve sort of automatically for free. You get the binding problem.
I don't think that's so much of a problem. So the binding problem, I guess, classically stated, is the problem that we seem to have a single unified experience, many different aspects to it. I have this mug. It's got shape, color, shade. All of these features seem bound together, but we know in the brain that neurons that are coding for orientation are in separate areas to ones that are coding for color and so on. So how does it all get bound together? I think that's the classic. I mean, you of course were with Francis wrote a lot with. Did you write with Christoph von der Malsberg about binding through synchrony? Or
no.
When?
He wrote by himself, and then Francis Crick and I wrote.
Right.
Yeah, way back when.
Yeah. So it's an interesting observation. I'm just not sure it's a huge problem. If the brain can be in some kind of macroscopic state that corresponds to consciousness, whether it's a field state or something like that, then your binding problem is not such a pressing problem after all.
It depends on the distances.
Things have to be exactly, the thing about entanglement is you're saying effectively these things are the same thing.
They're all one meta.
And I don't think you
cannot decompose them individual bits, right? They're all one integrated system.
I'm not sure you would need that in order to solve the binding problem. The other thing, just before we while it's still on my mind is you were being a bit rude about illusionism, and I want to chastise you for being a bit too rude about illusionism. Yeah, as I said, I'm a phenomenal realist too, and so if somebody tells me, you're just mistaken that you're conscious and have conscious experiences, I would think, phooey, that's not good. But I think it's possible to say that conscious experiences exist, but they may not be exactly what we think they are. And that for me is some people keep trying to tell me I'm an illusionist because I'm sympathetic to things like that. And in which case, fine, but I do resist the word because I think it's got all this baggage of denying that there's
but people use it. People themselves use it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, some people do, and so I don't hold with that stronger form of it. But a good analogy for me comes with something like how the experience colors. Like we experience colors as being objectively real out there in the universe. That this book, which happens to be lying on my desk, is
funny that's mustard. Your book.
Is like a mustard color, and the book really seems to have this mustard color, and but we know now that like, well, it's not that colors don't exist. It's just that they're not what they seem to be. They're not mind-independent properties of the physical universe. They're surface reflectance properties that lawfully relate to experiences of color somehow. So
in mental constructs, ultimately.
Yeah, I think so. And so there's aspects of consciousness which we can be mistaken about. And I think this does bring us a little bit to where we started, that we can be mistaken about the fact that conscious experiences need to involve a self. And you and I
totally.
both agree that that's not necessary. There may be other aspects of conscious experiences that
classical illusions, Anil, right? Classical illusions, they all show that there can be a discrepancy between what I think I see and what's out there.
So all I'm saying is that is just expanding that a bit further and saying, so there may be aspects of conscious experiences that lead us to assume or think that there's something fundamentally physically inexplicable about them that are also a little bit illusory in their nature, that we may just, and this may be partly because of again, something we've already mentioned, which is that consciousness has this unique property that we have immediate kind of epistemological access to it. In that sense, we're trying to explain something which is completely different from other things in the universe.
That's right.
We try to explain.
Exactly. That's radical different from matter. Exactly.
But that doesn't mean that it cannot be a property of material stuff. It's just that it means that we might not find an explanation constructed in terms of material stuff ever intuitively satisfying. Because like, who the hell finds many things in science? Some things in science are not intuitively satisfying. They don't give us this sense of, aha, yes, of course, it has to be this way. Quantum mechanics doesn't do that. So we may set a different standard for explanations of consciousness that is actually just not really an appropriate standard to have, simply because we ourselves are conscious. So we want the explanation to convey a kind of potency that it's just not reasonable to expect of any scientific explanation of anything.
That's a defeatist argument, and I don't buy that. Because then you say, well, then these materialists, well, yeah, because then we edge closer to, well, there really isn't anything fundamental to explain there. And then we're off in illusion land where, well, you're really confused, Daniel. There really isn't anything like it to be sad or to see green. It's just that you tend to push a button green.
Now you're just invoking slippery slope argument and saying that's where I'll end up. Well, I don't think that's true. I think there's a good place to end up, and we've already sketched some of this landscape. It's ending up in a place where we recognize that in order to explain consciousness, we no longer have to explain why there always has to be an experiencing subject. We just don't have to explain that as a fundamental feature. We have to explain it as a contingent feature. So already our questions about consciousness have to change. In free will, we're seeing the same kind of evolution of the questions too. Like, does a satisfying explanation of free will have to have to involve some sort of uncaused cause that changes things, makes things happen that otherwise wouldn't happen? Or does it have to just account for the phenomenology of free will and explain, how certain kinds of physical systems have a sort of agency that others don't? And of course, you can argue about whether that's possible or not. I think it's totally possible.
See, it happens. Every time we talk about free will, my right hand goes up. Amazing. My right hand is free will.
Yeah, but I think we should talk about it a bit. But for me, it serves this another example of how the questions people ask evolve over time as the assumptions we make about what constitutes a satisfying answer, change. And we no longer in free will need to think of there's a dualistic thing that's swooping in and changing things at the micro level in the brain. There may be many other ways we can explain everything we need to explain about free will. Of course, there'll be some people, like maybe Robert Sapolsky, who will say, well, no, you're not explaining free will, then you're explaining something else. And in order for it to be free will, some neuron has to change its behavior in a way it wouldn't otherwise do. And I think that's just misconstrued.
Yeah, and also depends on, and maybe we should now switch and talk about integrated information theory if you want to. Because within integrated information theory, if you follow its intrinsic powers ontology, free will is perfectly compatible.
Yes,
because ultimately,
ultimately,
the true actors is not the brain, but the unfolded causal power of the substrate that truly exists, and that what truly exists can freely cause under certain condition. Not every decision is a freely caused one, but a conscious, deliberately made decision, according to IT, is free. Doesn't emerge. It's free in the classical sense.
So this is good. Let's move on to IIT then. And if I may, I'd like to start by returning to this observation about your own intellectual history, which did change from being someone who was really the leading voice of the neural correlates of consciousness approach to protagonist of, with Giulio Tononi, the main architect of these theories, integrated information theory. So I'd love to hear in your own words, what catalyzed that transition, and also maybe tell the people listening fundamentally what IIT is, which is always a hard ask to do. It's not the easiest theory to summarize in a few sentences.
Understood. Yeah, so already when I worked, as you know, I worked with 14 years with Francis Crick, and early on we said, let's not worry about theory and metaphysics. But then as we pushed this program, try to convince people to start this experimental program to explore the neural correlates of consciousness, he particularly was also insistent, ultimately, we don't just want correlates, because we were both sure. I was, of course, overconfident, and that was Dave Chalmers, etc. But we are both sure that in the fullness of time, this program would run its course, and we would know these neurons or these neural mechanisms or these microtubules or whatever it is in that part of the brain doing 40 hertz or synchrony or whatever else you want to think is the NCC for seeing red or being in pain or whatever, right? But then you have to ask, well, if it's 40 hertz, why not 30 hertz? Why not 50 hertz? If it's that part of the brain, why not this part? If it's that molecule, why not this molecule, right? So we both realized we need a theory. And then the one I sort of got involved in, because it's the most elegant one, and appeals to me as a physicist, is integrated information theory, because it starts from what I consider is primary. It starts with consciousness. See, what Francis and I tried to do, and you and many others, Anil, is that you take the brain and then you squeeze the juice of consciousness out of the brain, right? By saying it's, as I said, it's 40 hertz or the claustrum or, the frontal, the global workspace or whatever else. And then of course, you face Dave Chalmers' heart problem. But if you start with consciousness, first you start with consciousness. Consciousness really only exists for itself. It's absolute existence. The only thing that only exists for itself. And then you look at for a substrate that shares these fundamental properties of any experience. You brought up the word axiomatic, Anil, right? The five, according to IIT, the five axiomatic property that any conscious experience has to have. It exists for itself. It's intrinsic. It's definite. It's unitary. It's bounded, and it's also structured. Any conscious experience has to have that. It doesn't have to have space. It doesn't have to have time. It doesn't have to have experience of self. But it's for itself. Any experience, it's for itself, for the entity that is experienced. It's definite, but it feels like something. It's specific. It's different from any other experience. It's one, and it's structured. So in my case, there were three things. There was this bright light, and there was terror and ecstasy. So there are, three different components. And then the theory goes around and looks for which substrates out in the world obey these properties using an operational measure grounded in causal power. And what the theory means by that, I don't make any assumption about what exists out there. All I'm looking for is transition probability matrix. So I have a system, a brain or computer chip or piece of a planet, whatever, and I manipulate this state and I observe that state, and I manipulate that state over there, and I measure this state, right? So I do that for a system, and then I can describe just using the mathematics of this transition probability, I can describe all the intrinsic causal power. I can unfold, as it were. I can look at, well, what's the causal power of these two neurons upon those three? Or what's the causal power of these 10 neurons on those? Causal power means if they're in a particular state, with what probability will they be in another state? If my influence on the next state is nil, because it's random, the next state is totally random as a function of the current state, I have no causal power. And so you can do that for every possible subset of every possible, subset of neurons or transistors or whatever your units are. And the theory calls it unfolding. And then it makes this radical step. It says this unfolded causal power, that is what consciousness is. Nothing more, nothing less. So any quality, any experience that has a particular quality has to map one-to-one onto that. So in other words, the intrinsic causal power has to map on every aspect of the phenomenology, and every aspect of the phenomenology has to be explainable in terms of this unfolded intrinsic cause-effect power. That's the program of the theory.
I think that was really, really nicely explained, actually. I think so. Yeah, I mean, historically, it's kind of so when I think shortly before I first met you, I'd moved to San Diego to do my postdoc with Jerry Edelman. But part of the reason I'd moved there, a large part of the reason, was because I'd read papers that Julio had written with Edelman and Olaf Sporns in the late 90s about consciousness and complexity and the so-called dynamic core hypothesis.
And he left already, or did you overlap?
Yeah, no. So that was one of the great frustrations. Was by the time I got there in 2001, he'd left and gone to Wisconsin, and had not left on particularly good terms with Edelman. Let's leave it at that. And so it was quite problematic. But I was fascinated by these ideas, which were in some ways the seeds of IIT without the sort of the more radical claims, because the early ideas that Tononi, Olaf, and Sporns and Edelman had written about were still in a kind of generalized correlation approach, right? You could say that consciousness has these features which are common to all conscious experiences. Perhaps it didn't say axiomatic, but in the limit, that's what it would mean, that they are unified and they are differentiated, integrated, and informative, to use the new words. And so the idea was, okay, if that's true for all or nearly all conscious experiences, then the mechanisms responsible for consciousness should also have those properties. And I found this very appealing, and I still do. And it had been the first thing that I remember reading about consciousness that really grabbed me and thought, okay, this is really a way forward, because now we are not merely, and not to do down your amazing contributions in those early days, we're not merely looking for correlations. That's very valuable, but we're beginning to explain. We're beginning to say, okay, this is why these patterns of brain activity go along with consciousness, because they have the same properties. And I found that appealing then, and I find it appealing now. And I think I mention this just because I think it speaks to why I still have some hope for this broad program, because I don't think it's merely limited to saying, okay, we find that these neurons are responsible, and so then we're left banging into Dave's hard problem. I do think that as we come up with explanations that provide richer, explanatorily richer bridges between how things seem at the level of the physical and how things seem at the level of the phenomenological, then we don't have this arbitrariness that leads us to think, holy shit, we're still totally in the dark about why consciousness is there or why it has the form that it does. So that I think, for me, that just reserves some hope. And my own take on it, as I talk about in my book, is this real problem approach, just to slightly annoy Dave, but also because I think the dichotomy between the hard problem and the easy problem has also been a little bit hindering of progress, because things don't need to fall out according to that dichotomy. I think there's a middle ground, which is the real problem, which is, again, by analogy to the vitalism and the history of life, that as we begin to explain properties of living systems, or in this case conscious systems, in terms of their underlying mechanisms, the suspicion that there's a need for something extra, something special, is dissolved. So I think the hard problem can be dissolved rather than solved. So I think there's a shared recognition between us that this way of thinking is really nice. When you try to identify common properties, things that seem to be or maybe are shared axiomatics or conscious experiences, and then ask what kinds of systems, whether it's networks of neurons or unfolded causal powers, can have these properties, then I think that's really, really good. But of course, there are different ways of doing that, and so I've always been a fan of distinguishing weak approaches to something and strong approaches to something. You have like strong emergence, things emerge and are totally irreducible from what they emerge from. Weak emergence, something is more than the sum of its parts in a way that still makes sense. I think the same thing can be done with IIT. We had a paper on this, working with Adam Barrett and others and Pedro Mediano for many years now, basically trying to further that initial program that Giulio pioneered back then of like, how do we build these mappings between phenomenology and mechanism? And the reason, I'll come to the point, the reason I like this approach is because it is more easily testable, or rather it leads to things that are more readily testable. We both know that the measure of phi, that is sort of the central quantity in IIT, is in practice very, very difficult to measure for any non-trivial system. And one of the reasons for this is it requires you, as you say, knowing the full kind of transition probability matrix. You need to know everything it could do, even if it hasn't done it. And that's really challenging, infeasible for most things. Doesn't mean that it's not correct. It just means that it's really bloody difficult.
Agreed.
But there are other ways to do it, which can measure things like phi that don't have that same requirement, that can be measured on the basis of merely observing systems as they behave in the states they enter into. So I do treat myself a little bit in the family of IIT sympathetic people, but I think there's a broader space of ideas here. But as you said, the really novel things here are when you take, you drink the full IIT Kool-Aid and you really say, okay, things only exist. It's always a claim about what exists and what doesn't, which is why the free will thing is, I think it's a really cute point about free will. It's a cute argument. It says, okay, we resolve the problem of free will causing things at the level of physics by saying, well, actually, all the thing that fundamentally exists is the conscious experience. And so there's no problem of competing causes at a lower level because the lower level causes don't really exist.
I think that's terrible elegant. It's elegant and it explains our subjective experience.
Well, I think it's elegant. It's certainly innovative, and I do like it because it sort of suggests that other ways of thinking about this are possible. But we know in the last year there's been quite a lot of pushback against IIT, and I don't know. So what do you think about that? What's your strongest, in the light of the criticism that it may be not testable, or that it overclaims, or is sort of, in the words of some people, like evidently ridiculous in some sort of way, it implies panpsychism or entails panpsychism. What's your strongest defense of IIT as a powerful experimental program?
Well, so for instance, the construction, and you've also been involved in this, of a conscious meter, right? Of a measure, like differentiation and integration, that you can apply where the rubber hits the road, because all of what we're talking about, it sort of seems very esoteric. But then, and I had this case now personally, when you get a call and your loved one had a cardiac arrest or a stroke or massive TBI, they're not responsive. They're not conscious. That's what the doctor will tell you, or the nurse. Well, how do they know that? Well, they ask the patient, and they look for signs. Can they do voluntary eye movements, finger movements? Can they talk, etc.? Well, if they can, you're not considered conscious. So it's a strict behavioral measure. And what happens in our country is really quite shocking, Anil, is that 80% of these people, after 5 to 7 days, for all sorts of reasons, the doctor, the medical team talks with the family, and they decide to withdraw life-critical support. They pull the ventilator. Although we now know through a variety of experiments, such like Adrian Owen, etc., that up to 20% of these people are actually conscious, yet are either unable to signal because they don't have the cognitive wherewithal anymore, the motor cortex is destroyed, or for reasons like that. So at IIT, a very crude approximation of IIT sort of has led to this device. So that's pretty slick. That's pretty cool, right? And then, now there's this ongoing debate, are the neural correlates in us, the neural correlates of consciousness, are in the back, where, the theory holds that because of the topographic cortical structures in the back of the posterior hot zone, it would maximize integrated information and therefore intrinsic causal power as compared to the front. That debate will be resolved. And, in fact, if you talk to clinician, it is already resolved. So again, now, of course, you can say, well, the theory has to make all sorts of approximation to get from its pure mathematical form to the actual dirty calculus, to make all sorts of approximations to actually calculate that. And I grant you that. That's just true right now. I feel a little bit like physicists in the 19th century that had to make all these series approximations, and endless expansions of various series, because they didn't have computers, and everything had to be handheld, and so they simply couldn't compute most thermodynamic quantities couldn't be computed. They require modern computers, and that's a limitation. But as you point out, that doesn't make the theory wrong. It just makes the theory difficult to test exactly. Right. And that's, of course, it's a strength or weakness of the theory, because it's very axiomatic, it's very precise, makes it difficult, but also it is very precise. That should be a feature of any scientific theory.
Yes, I think that's true. That's certainly a distinctive feature. And I think, I wrote a review on theories of consciousness with Tim Bain in Nature a couple of years ago. And that's one of the things we pointed out, that theories in general, I think, overstate their level of specificity, and IIT is distinctive in this way, that it is very precise. It's sort of precise in a different way, right? It's precise in a way that's hard to get empirical grip on, but it's got this in principle precision, which is certainly, I think, appealing. Just wanted to return to the case
consciousness meter.
The consciousness meter. I think this is really important. I think it's important for a number of reasons. The first reason it's important is because it certainly does showcase that science of consciousness matters. It's very easy, I think, for some people to think that this is like just intellectual indulgence. We're trying to figure out something because we've got the luxury of wondering about these existential questions of who we are and what exists and so on. It really matters. Consciousness research, even though it's hard, even though it's controversial, it matters in all sorts of contexts, in making these life or death decisions after traumatic brain injury or other kinds of brain injury. It matters in animal welfare, in deciding how we treat other potentially conscious creatures. It matters in law when we think about where we hold people responsible. It matters in mental health. The list goes on. But I just want to make sure that we land that point. I think we probably agree on this, that it's an urgent science to pursue, not merely an interesting and important
one. It's a fetus, conscious or not.
Exactly. I mean, yeah, and there was some recent papers on this. I think part of the polarization of the start of life, debates or right to life, is that people there's no voice about whether something is, at what point does consciousness arise in human development has not been in the room. But anyway, it's critical. Now, and you will know a bit more about this than me, having worked very closely with Giulio for a while, but I've worked with Marcello. And so the thing is, I think it's probably right to say that these measures of the measure that's used that can actually quantify consciousness in a non-responsive patient is something called the Perturbation Complexity Index. Mm-hmm. And I think it's fair to say this was inspired by IIT. However, I think it's not true to say that it's an approximation to phi. You called it a brute approximation. This is something Adam Barrett's been very consistently pointing out and explaining to me, this difference. And I think it's a difference that matters. It's a difference between a proxy and an approximation. So you have something which is an approximation when you know how that relates to the thing that you're actually interested in. So, the laws of Newtonian physics is an approximation to relativity because we know precisely how they relate and when it's a good and when it's a bad approximation. One asymptotes to the other under certain conditions. Other things are proxies, which is that there's not really a very clear relationship, but they stand in some useful way nonetheless. So like GDP in an economy is a good proxy for standard of living, but it's not clear how it actually relates. And I think this is important because it means that if you see PCI, be useful in these contexts, to me, this is not strong evidence either for or against the theory, because it's not really testing the relationship between phi and the theory, because there's no good understanding of how PCI and phi relate in practical situations. So this is just a point where
I hear you.
Not to trash IIT on this at all, but I think it's a mistake to rely too heavily on that experiment as evidence for IIT. I think it's totally fair to say it's strongly inspired by it and may not have happened otherwise. The one experiment that I really, the stuff front and back is also very interesting. I must admit, it's a little bit deflating sometimes, isn't it? When you think we used to talk about left and the right brain, and now it's front and back brain, like 30 years later.
Yes, I agree.
But also, stuff consciousness being largely associated with posterior back of the brain processes is of course going to be compatible with a bunch of other things as well. There are, however, some experiments which I think kind of cool because they arise more specifically from distinctive aspects of IIT. So there's one I'm sure you probably are aware of, which is going on in another of these adversarial collaborations that I'm only marginally involved with on the advisory board of, which is looking at whether there's a difference between merely inactive and inactivated neurons.
Yes.
And just to unpack that in plain language, IIT predicts that it should make a difference to one's conscious experience between two cases. One case where a neuron is just not firing, and the other case where the neuron is prevented from firing. It could not fire. In both cases, the neuron doesn't fire. But
in the first, it could. Right?
In the first, it could, if it were, receive the right kind of input. In the second, it could not. Now, this seems incredibly counterintuitive. And, I want to give it to IIT. This is great because it's made a prediction which really would not follow from any other theories, and which is at least in principle testable. It's very hard in practice to test it because, how do you get a state where neurons are actually inactive and then you inactivate them? It's very tricky. But one can imagine, a bit like you were saying, and I was saying about life, that's just a historical thing, that certain things are hard. Experiments in any field have been very, very hard to do, but this seems like it's potentially doable. And the collaboration I'm involved in is making like a first go. It's with Cyril Pinart and Umberto Olcese, and Giulio's involved as well. And I think this is fascinating.
The story I like to tell here is what was it? Is it called Silver Blaze, by the Sherlock Holmes story, Silver Blaze?
No.
But so Sherlock Holmes, so there's this well, it involves a horse that got stolen, but the critical point, at some point, Sherlock Holmes goes to Inspector Lestrade, who's clueless as usual, and say you should pay attention to the dog. And the inspector says, why the dog? The dog didn't bark, but could have barked, right? And why did it not bark? Because it knew the perpetrator, right? That's why it didn't bark. Now, it would have been different if the dog would have been, let's say, shot dead, right? Because then he couldn't have barked.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's a good one.
Another way people are trying to test it. Melanie Bolly is doing these experiments with pure presence. These meditators who go into these very special states where they claim there's no more thought, there's no more perception except just a clear lucidity. And her interpretation of the G data is that there's no spiking, there's no delta, so the meditators are not asleep. There's also an absolutely minimum of high gamma power, so it's a relatively little. As you said, in the limit, of course, it's impossible to establish are there really no neurons fire, and that's very unlikely. But it tries to approximate, just like this experiment that you mentioned. Yeah, it's a very counterintuitive firing, because most neuroscientists says, well, look, I look down at the neurons aren't telling me anything. So how could this be conscious, right?
Yeah, but I mean, it's like, it's maybe less weird than it at first sounds, because of course, as you said, with the dog that doesn't bark as well, part of that is, even if the dog not barking is informative whether or not the dog could have barked in many cases. Just as in the same way.
No, wait. If the dog would have been poisoned, then it would have been less informative.
Yes, exactly. It would have been less informative. But I think the main message I take from that is that if the dog is not poisoned, it's not barking as informative for Sherlock Holmes. Yeah. And of course, that's just true in standard neuroscience anyway. Like, the fact that neurons fire is only kind of meaningful because sometimes they don't.
Yes, but to most neuroscientists, the idea that any piece of brain tissue could signal something by not firing, because everyone has intuition. Well, conscience has to be you communicate something to somewhere.
Yeah. Well, no. Okay, now I'm pushing back a bit, because I think these are two separate points. I think almost any theory would, like, even back to the synchrony. Let's say you were right about your 40 hertz theory. That depends on neurons not firing at certain times for things to fire in synchrony at 40 hertz. Any application of information theory to neuroscience relies on the time they don't fire. This is separate from the point about the neurons not being able to fire and not firing versus being able to fire and not firing, which is the dog being poisoned versus
do you know any other theory, global workspace or local recurrency, any other theory that says, well, for example, global workspace, right? How does conscience occur? It occurs in this massive discharge from the front to the back, right? Yeah. All these workspace neurons. So I guess that would be paradigmatic, the opposite position.
I guess so, but even something like that, I think if you unpack it in any detail, broadcast within a global workspace would also depend on, at some times, these neurons do not fire. It's just not emphasized very much, but I think it's not. I don't think it's a particularly deep point. I just think that anything that talks about neurons firing as being important at least implies that them not firing is also important. And if we talk about the application of information theory to neuroscience, that is definitely has the implication that not firing is informative.
But information theory has this very pernicious aspect. Information theory only works because there's someone like you that knows what patterns are. the brain itself, we all agree there's no homunculus in the brain. So the meaning, how does meaning arise, right? That's why I think using information theory here is not relevant. Information theory is useful for me as an external neuroscientist studying the flow of information. But for the brain itself, it doesn't mean anything, right?
Well, no, but I'm not talking about semantics at all here. I'm just saying that in terms of brain dynamics, it matters that things don't fire. And then, that may have downstream effects in the brain. It may be things that we read out and interpret through the lens of information theory. I'm dwelling on this a little bit because I think the critical distinctive example of IIT is not that things that don't fire can be meaningful. It's the fact it's precisely the things that aren't firing can be differently meaningful depending on whether they could fire or not.
Which is an argument about intrinsic causal power.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just
power.
a separate. So that's. I just want to focus down on that. So I think this is anyway. This is. Listen,
Yeah.
I'm seeing that we've been talking for a very long time, but there's something else that I wanted to talk to you about before. And I wonder. I have a feeling that we'll agree to a point, and then we might agree for different reasons.
Well, let's not make this a habit.
Well, I think we've disagreed about plenty, but there's plenty we disagree on. So, artificial intelligence. Can or will AI be conscious? We see a lot of discussion of this. I think a lot of it is fundamentally confused, but I'd be interested in your take.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so we have to, and you and I will probably agree on this, strongly distinguish intelligence from consciousness, right? And for a starter, many people don't. They lump it, they assume AI, well, that means it's conscious. But you can perfectly well imagine a super intelligent machine that conceptually doesn't feel like anything, because ultimately it's about behavior. I mean, intelligence is about behavior, and consciousness is not necessarily about behavior or function. So again, if you take IIT's point of view, it would say, well, it depends on the substrate, not on the actual input-output. So IT would say there isn't a Turing test because there isn't a specific function for consciousness. There isn't a Turing test that you can pass where you say, okay, if it passes this test, like you ask it, like, you can do on Claude now. You can ask it because it doesn't have the guardrails on. You can ask it, is it conscious? It'll tell you, of course, I'm sentient. While ChatGPT, it has these guardrails, it says, oh, no, I'm just an LLM because it doesn't want to scare the general public. So the IIT says you have to look at not at that, but the underlying hardware where the causal work happens. And the causal work happens at the level of the microprocessor or the chips or the GPT, TPUs, whatever the actually hardware is. And there, if you compare so there's a paper coming out in next week or so. If you IIT apply to those architectures, says that the causal power, because of the very, very, very low connectivity, right? Typically one transistor talks to 3 or 4 other transistors and gets input from 3 or 4 other transistors, compared to a brain where you have 50,000 inputs into one neuron, 50,000 outputs with heavy, heavy overlap. The causal power of these machines is tiny, and it's going to be the same no matter what program you run on it. You can actually show this by induction in a generalized Turing machine very nicely within IIT. Assuming IIT is the correct theory of consciousness, you can show rigorously that these particular type of hardware, as they're in the cloud in our laptops, will never be conscious. Although they can have they can mimic intelligence. The easier argument I find, it's a less rigorous one, but it seems more convincing to most. You can, it's to distinguish a simulation from the real thing. You can perfectly well simulate a rainstorm; it doesn't get wet. You can simulate a nuclear explosion, as people at Lawrence Livermore are doing, but you don't have to be afraid that your computer is going to blow up and spew radioactivity. You can simulate. The best example is you can write down Einstein's field equation of general relativity for the central mass, the 3 million central mass at the center of our galaxy, and you can simulate that it turns into a black hole, nothing can escape, but you don't have to be concerned that if you switch on this computer simulation, you're going to be sucked into your laptop because it doesn't bend space-time around it, because it doesn't have the causal power. it doesn't have the causal power of a large mass to bend space-time around it. So that's what IoT would say. The question is, IoT would say if you build computers in the image of the brain, like neuromorphic hardware, or possible quantum hardware, because, there the entanglement, the connectivity is vastly higher. If you have n bits and everyone is entangled, right, you got these 2 to the n entangled states. No one has done the computation there, but certainly for neuromorphic machines in the limit, you should be able to get human level consciousness, but not on digital machines.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah, I think that's what I expected you to say about this. And I think we agree too, largely about conventional AI. For me, my understanding of what IIT would say about this, I think is pretty much the same. It's really, so it's not substrate independent in that anything will do, but it's somewhat substrate flexible. It doesn't have to be carbon. It's just so long as the substrate can instantiate the right kind of causal architecture, then that's fine. But that's of course not going to be every kind of material in the universe. It might only be some kinds of material. So I actually think something similar, but probably for different reasons. So I guess my starting point on it is, rather than leaning on any particular theory of consciousness, whether it's IIT or even my own ideas about, predictive processing and life, I just think there are fundamental problems with the idea that consciousness is the kind of thing that standard computers can have. And part of that comes with just by identifying the psychological biases and confusions that lead us to assume that it's just about to happen or already there. And there's this conflation of intelligence with consciousness that you mentioned. There's also, the kind of anthropomorphism, anthropocentrism that I think is part of that. That we put on a pedestal things like language and intelligence, and then we project qualities into things that seem human-like on the basis of superficial similarities. All lead us to overestimate things like consciousness, or even actually things like intelligence and understanding in systems that don't actually have these properties in the way that really merit the term. But I think there's also more deeper problems with the idea that underpins a lot of the current narrative about consciousness and AI, which is computational functionalism. There was this recent long report by Robert Long and Patrick Butlin and others, which very nicely went through a lot of existing AI architectures and sort of assessed the credence about whether they could be conscious. But it was nice because at least it explicitly acknowledged that it was all conditional on computational functionalism being correct. And computational functionalism, for people listening, is this idea that computations are sufficient for consciousness. Get the computations right and you get consciousnness. And so it's a subset of functionalism more generally, which is that consciousness has to do with the functional organization rather than intrinsic properties of some material or some substrate. Not everything that's functionally organized is doing any kind of computation. So it's really quite a strong assumption that probably people just have taken to heart for too long because of the brain as computer metaphor having overextended its useful life a little bit.
Why do you it seems to me, given the power of LLMs, it's going to be this argument, it's going to be more and more powerful just because these LLMs overwhelms people's sense of attribution. Right?
Yeah, no, they put us into this epistemological crisis where we might become unable to resist attributing consciousness to these things, whatever we actually think is going on under the hood, in exactly the same way that some visual illusions can be completely compelling to us, even when we know what's actually going on. In the Muller-Lyer illusion, two lines look different lengths. We know they're the same length. We can go and measure them, but nonetheless, they will always look different to us. And so I worry that we'll be in a similar situation where we will have cognitively impenetrable illusions of machine consciousness, which will be very problematic in society. We're not used to that situation. It will screw around with our morals, with our ethics, with our interpersonal relationships. We'll be vulnerable. There's lots of moral problems there. But I also
think it'll lead to further dehumanization, in fact.
Yes.
Right. And de-emphasizing the human. Well, these machines are much better than you. They can remember better. They're more smarter.
Yeah. And there's a certain, I don't know, there's a diminution of the human condition that happens when we see ourselves in something as basically crappy as a large language model. I think we're much more than that.
Agreed. Totally.
But there are so many problems with this idea of computational functionalism that which implies really that if it's just about the computations and the computations can be done on any kind of substrate, then you just got to get those right and it's fine. Even if consciousness is
very widespread, right?
It's incredibly widespread. I mean, the one philosopher who pushed back against it a lot was John Searle, but he didn't really give a particularly strong reason, in my view, for pushing back against it. But his argument was a Chinese room argument, which is a different argument, more to do with understanding than to do with consciousness. I think there are better reasons to push back on it now, based on the problems with assuming that what brains do, whatever it is that they do, whether it's computational or something else, the difficulties in separating what they do from what they are. There's these standard thought experiments which just say, if you replace one neuron with a digital equivalent, no different. So why can't you replace all of them? This is a very bad argument. Brains are not the kinds of things where you can do that. And even from taking a computational perspective, the kinds of energy efficiency we see in brains means that if they are doing computation, they're doing it in a way which is very different from the separation of hardware and software that we see in standard architecture. Anyway, all of this is to say that I think we agree that the current direction of AI is not leading to consciousness, though it is leading to things that will give us the powerful and perhaps incorrigible impression of being conscious. I think where we will disagree is what would be sufficient. And for you, based on IIT, it's kind of anything that can instantiate the right kind of causal powers, intrinsic causal powers. And for me, and we haven't talked about this much, and we won't have time on this occasion, I still find myself drawn to these ideas of John Searle, that it's a property of living systems. And I think there are reasons for that. And the reason, actually, one reason comes from the title of your previous book, which I do have on the shelf, which is The Feeling of Life Itself. And there's the core phenomenology. If you try and strip out everything, maybe like Melanie is trying to do with minimal phenomenal experiences, for me, what's left, is the experience of being a living organism with nothing else built on that, just that. And if you ask what underpins that, for me, there's a very powerful narrative to be told in terms of every experience being underpinned by a certain kind of perceptual prediction that the brain is making about sensory signals. Some of these predictions have to do with the interior of the body. These predictions are more about keeping the body alive than figuring out where things are and what they do. And fundamentally, they drive right down into there's no sort of substrate level at which the predictions stop and the control stops. It goes right down into individual cells, so that minimization of prediction error in sensory circuits there's a direct line, a through line to minimization of thermodynamic energy and metabolism in cells.
Anil, does a single cell like a paramecium, do you think it has a feeling of life itself, a very primitive one?
I don't. The honest answer is I don't know. I doubt it. But I have no way of really knowing. I'm not a biopsychist, so I don't think that everything that is alive is conscious. It could be, but it seems to me that given how easily a human organism can lose consciousness, that's at least some reason to doubt that simply being alive is sufficient, even if
but that's
necessary.
Human level. That's human level.
Exactly. So this is why it's not a knockdown. It's not a knockdown argument.
Yeah.
But human consciousness does seem to be rather hard to maintain and create, and so it's very imperfect arguments against biopsychism. But I don't see a strong reason to believe that should be the case. But I am drawn to the idea that life is necessary, if not sufficient, for consciousness, based on this through line between the phenomenology on the one hand, it maps onto the feeling of life itself, and the and the fact that really everything that brains do is hard to disentangle it from its metabolic underpinnings. It's not
Agreed.
carbon chauvinism, other things that are alive, that might be fine. So we may agree in things like neuromorphic architectures are more likely to instantiate consciousness, but perhaps for different reasons.
I mean, IT at least admits the possibility that if you look at a single paramecium, there are like 5,000 different proteins. There are several billion proteins of 5,000 different species. They already have vast complexity, right?
Yeah.
So at least in principle, according to IT, it is possible that even a single cell feels like something.
Yes.
Now, it doesn't
yeah.
have a voice inside its head, and okay, yeah, we agree. I think
we agree on that.
A couple of things that I want to throw out. So I'm just going to throw these out and see how you two respond to it. So Metzinger recently published a book, The Elephant and the Blind. That's a fascinating chapter on lucid dreamless sleep, which could offer one way to demonstrate the existence of consciousness during a non-REM sleep. Hidden within the book, Metzinger presents a thesis suggesting that pure awareness might actually be an extremely abstract and subtle form of bodily awareness. Interestingly, he posits that this form of awareness isn't mediated through any internal receptor system. Instead, it's a direct, unmediated awareness of the brain itself. So it's like a kind of an intrinsic model of consciousness. So from this perspective, leads me to Anil. You take on that consciousness is primary anchor in the interoceptive predictive machinery of our bodies. So it's like this, like such as the sensory system in our guts and our blood vessel. However, Thomas leaned towards thinking there's something more fundamental at play. This fundamental aspect might be what responsible for the profound experience of silent, clear wakefulness, which could be described as a unique form of body representation. So that's what I want to throw it and see how you guys receiving it.
Sure. So I read a good chunk of Thomas Metzinger's new book, The Elephant and the Blind, which is a very, very impressive accomplishment, like his previous massive book, Being No One, was about 20 plus years ago. I do think I found it quite amusing in some way that a book that's arguing for a state of pure awareness is mainly consisted of enormous numbers of descriptions of the content of pure awareness. Is like there's something very necessarily paradoxical about that. Obviously, I'm pretty sympathetic to the idea that some minimal, for human beings, some sort of minimal form of consciousness might well be expressed as this sort of basic state of embodied awareness. So, I like Christof's phrase, the feeling of life itself. I think there's something really appealing about that. So that very much jibes with what I write about in my book about that's the kind of ground state of human or certainly evolved conscious states, and other things are elaborations of that. I don't know what to make of the idea that it's not mediated by any receptor system. There's always an indirect relationship between receptor system activity and the contents of consciousness anyway. Like some things are more clearly related, like visual experience. We have receptors in our eyes, and so on. Interoceptive things, we have certain interoceptive sensations. But then there's other kinds of conscious experiences which are only indirectly related, thoughts, beliefs, and so on. So I don't know. For that aspect, it's unclear what it means for the brain to have some basic experiencing of itself unmediated by any receptors or sensory channels. I think it's an interesting idea, but I wouldn't take that on board yet myself.
I agree. We know we're now beginning to map out the complete, particularly here at the Arm Institute, because that's what we do, mapping thousands of of different cell types. We and others have shown, you can see it, there are receptors in your entire body. Everything is wired, to the PNS and then to the CNS, right? The peripheral nervous system, which then flow into the central nervous system, particularly in the part of the brain called the insula. So we have receptors in the gut, in the spleen, in the kidneys, in the heart, of course, in our sexual organs, of course, everywhere in our skin, in our muscles. And we consistently devalue those, right? Because we emphasize vision and hearing, because they convey us information about the outside world. So it is true, we, all of them, in particular myself, have neglected the interoceptive aspect. And of course, if you do meditation, various forms of meditation, you become highly attuned to this. And also you see the effect of this in the placebo or nocebo responses, right? Whether it's psychedelics or other form of psychotherapy or in immune system, immunization, all of in these things, we all know that what you believe, what you consciously believe about this method, whether it's good or bad, will profoundly influence whether how it actually acts on your body. And that's a paradigmatic case of your brain, particular cortex, reaching out throughout your body and affecting the bodily state of all these organs. And as far as we know, everything is mediated through very specific receptors. So I'm not sure what Thomas means by receptor-less perception. I don't know how that would work.
I'll send you the book when we finish this. Maybe you could read on to it. Yeah. Right. Something I'm going to touch on quickly. This arousal versus orgasm states. In Tibetan Buddhism, they talk about this thing called awakening, which is, it's all about, reaching heightened level of awareness and insight through meditation, like spiritual practice, tantric practice, things like that. So it's like hitting a whole new level of consciousness, So now let's take in psychology. You have got this concept called arousal, which is basically about being super alert and ready to respond to stuff. It's kind of like being, in that super focused state when you are totally immersed in something. So when we talk about arousal in Tibetan Buddhism, it's not just about getting hyped up, but it's about reaching this deeper, profound state of awakening where you are more in tune with yourself and the world around you. So now, here the interesting part is while there are some similarity between the experiences and the effect of arousal, meditations, and orgasm. So there's still a lot we don't know. I think we need more research to really understand how these different states of, consciousness intersect and what they can teach us about our mind and spirituality, because the experiential aspect of this phenomenon in various cultural and spiritual contexts, it could provide valuable insight, into our well-being. And, it's healing, and then, the subjective natures of experience. So that's what I want to throw in. I think that two particular state, it's not properly explored. I think we need more research into it. Yeah. So what's your thought on that?
Well, I don't have a huge amount to say about that, frankly. I mean, I think it's certainly the case that it takes us back to where Christof and I started this conversation, really, that paying attention to unusual, or maybe not that unusual, but a lot of consciousness research has taken the form of sticking somebody, a psychology undergraduate, in front of a computer monitor and saying, are the dots moving left or right? Which is amazing, but it's limited. And so paying attention to the range of kinds of experiences that we can encounter, whether in normal everyday lived experience or in unusual states, some of which might take years of practice to cultivate. This is very valuable. I will return to my perspective on those, which is that these are insights into the into precisely that, into the range of possible conscious experiences, what conscious experiences might be like. They're not necessarily insights into the way things actually are.
Yeah, you said it beautiful. I've nothing to add.
Thanks so much, Ivy. First, I wanted to say thanks again for a great talk. I'm always intrigued. I'm partially sympathetic and always questioning for IIT, so I appreciate a discussion on this. I was wondering, earlier you mentioned something that got me really thinking, and that was talking about how some of these ideas integrate, and it seemed like you were flirting with the idea of emergence, whether the constitutive components would need to have either characteristics, traits, or I don't know if you explicitly said intelligence or consciousness, which word for it, and yet it seemed like they'd need there to be there on the whole. If that were the case, that would be excluding any sort of type of emergence, really, which would seem to necessitate, if we believe consciousness is real, some sort of panpsychism. And I was just curious in general where you guys come down in terms of this idea of particularly consciousness, on how it emerges, or if it's a kind of universal phenomenon, or how you feel about that. It's something that always is intriguing to me. And again, I really appreciate both your time and your works and your books, and you being here and discussing this. So thank you very much for your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Brian. IIT, assuming IIT, within the theory of IIT, it's not an emergent theory. So it's not that you need 42 bits of integrated information to be conscious. Anything that is a whole, anything that has some causal power upon itself, this may be as minute as, certainly as a single cell, or maybe even a subatomic particle that has some minimal amount of causal interaction within it, per IIT would be a whole, would feel like something. Now, of course, if it's a particle or even a single cell, it would feel almost like nothing. It would feel like just being something versus being nothing, but it would feel like something. So it's not an emergent theory. It's not the idea that you pack enough neurons together at some point, you get something, like water is wet and two molecules of water don't really get wet. It's not a theory like that at all.
That your position, just for my understanding, is that the position that would you agree with that, or would you disagree with that point of view?
I don't know. I mean, within IIT makes perfect sense. I mean, because that's how it's built. It uses an extremum principle of the sort that are very common in physics. Like if you take a bicycle chain, it adopts one particular shape. Which shape does it adopt? It's the one that maximizes or minimizes the least action. Same thing here. IIT says what exists the most, and those are these little local maxima of integrated integrated information. That makes perfect sense to me. Although I must admit, I came from a position when I started with Francis Crick, we somehow thought, well, 2 neurons don't have it, 1,000 neurons don't have it, and then some point, and this is a widespread intuition in neuroscience, that it's sort of an emergent. And then people discuss, is it weak or is it strong emergentism? But IIT is just very different.
Yeah, so I'm one of these people that discusses weak and strong emergence. I think in trying to find ways where the concept might be useful. So, I think that if you take a canonical example where people sometimes say emergence is relevant, it might be something like a flock of birds. It seems like the flock has a behavior, an autonomy, an agency of its own that goes beyond the birds that make it up. The whole is somehow more than the sum of its parts. Now, this has been a tricky notion to substantiate without falling into problematic assumptions about dualism. Let's say consciousness is emergent from matter because it's more than the sum of all the things that make it up, more than the sum of any neurons or whatever you might have. And I think that's not a useful line of thinking. But I do think it is useful to try and say, okay, look, flocks of birds seem to have this property wherein there's something interesting about their macroscopic description, their coarse graining, which is somehow different from the description of the combined description of the elements. And if we can find ways to make that mathematically precise, what we have in hand are operationalizations of emergence that might be useful in relating how lots of different parts can relate to things that have a global macroscopic appearance. And so I treat it rather as like a part of the family of these tools to address this real problem of consciousness, where we're trying to build bridges between mechanism and properties of phenomenal experience. And arguably a property of phenomenal experience is that it's sort of macroscopic unified state that, in the philosophical jargon, supervenes on a bunch of other stuff underneath it, the neurons or whatever they might be. And measures of emergence that can help us get a handle on that, I think, can be useful for constructing explanations and predictions and be part of our theoretical armory without us getting into any weird metaphysical issues about things suddenly popping into existence that didn't exist before and existing in a different plane. So,
well, I guess it depends what you mean by weird. So if you take the classical Bell state, right? So you got two photons that are entangled.
Yeah.
One has a spin up, one has a spin down. This system, as long as it's entangled, it cannot be described as a sum of the individual or as a product. It's not a product state by definition.
Yeah.
Right? That's how it's defined.
Yeah.
So it has to be treated holistically. And again, that's not a case of emergence. It's not that, if you have 50 quantum bits, you get entanglement. Entanglement either occurs or doesn't occur at the level of individual. So in that sense, it's and we have this in quantum mechanics. It's very striking. Either you're entangled or you're not entangled. So
sure.
I take that as an intuition, right? What could be.
Yeah, I think that's fine. That's compatible with what I'm saying too. But I'm saying there are concepts like this that apply not just in those kind of Bell states, but in things like flocks of birds and things, in things like economies, in many systems where things can be said to exist at macroscopic levels in some way, yet be composed of many of parts, and understanding the relationship between the parts and the whole is one of the challenges that we're still, again, colleagues of mine like Adam Barrett, Pedro, and Fernando Rosas and others are trying to develop measures of emergence. And it turns out, like measures of complexity, there are many different ways you can cut this cake. And I think that's interesting because it nuances the concept of emergence. It's not just one thing. There are many aspects to it. Christof just mentioned one of them that applies at very, very small scales. There are others that might apply to collections where, you have to have some degree of ensemble statistics going on.
Anil, what would you say if I said that IIT is actually a theory of Mereology? It precisely describes in one instance the relationship between parts and the whole, right? Because it says a whole is whatever is the local maximum of intrinsic cause effect power, right?
Right. Yeah.
And
so
I may be wrong, but but that's what the theory is.
In fact, that's what I thought you were going to say at the beginning of the answer to this question. And when you said it's sort of not emergentist, I thought, well, actually, there's a sense in which IIT is precisely a theory of how wholes are more than the sum of their parts.
Yeah, but it's not emergent. It's not emergent in a sense.
Then we're dealing with semantics, right? Because so you just mean something different. But if we just allow that, it's as you said, it's a Mereology is this part whole relationship. So and I think IIT makes some very precise claims about that.
Okay, yeah.
And for some people that's emergence, for other people it isn't, and that's fine.
Yeah, to me that is an emergent. That's why I accuse him for being a physicalist on the previous podcast, but he defended it. He said he's not a physicalist.
I hope I am audible.
Yeah.
And thank you for having me here. It was a really interesting conversation. Okay, so my question is regarding to Anil. Is this that when you says that the brain makes predictions, or just correct me if I'm wrong, or what you call as the controlled hallucination. So I'm just asking on a more philosophical basis, like, is the entirety of the reality experienced by the brain, is it entirely hallucination, or hallucination is an added on already existing sensory perception? Which way we should understand it?
I'm not sure I want to go with either of those options. What I mean by the term controlled hallucination, it's got a long history. I borrowed it from other people before me, is that the way in which we experience the world, the universe, whatever's really out there, is always a construction. It's never the thing itself. I mean, that philosophically, one of the main antecedents of this way of thinking is Immanuel Kant and his idea that there's a noumenon, what is, which is always hidden behind a sensory veil, always inaccessible. We will only ever experience some kind of interpretation of it. And you can argue how deep this goes, whether it's not just things like colors, which are very obviously sort of interpretations of some other physical property, but things like space and time as well might be contingent aspects of the way brains interpret physical reality rather than actually what's out there. But this is why phrases like controlled hallucination are both useful but also dangerous, as in any kind of simple analogy. Hallucination I use because I think it underlines that all of our experiences are construction. When we colloquially hallucinate things, we typically mean that the brain's made this up and we're seeing something, we're hearing something that's not there. And my point is that, well, that's true for all of our experience. The brain makes up everything that we experience, but it's also controlled. It's dependent on, evolution has made damn sure that the contents of our experience are in most cases adaptively and lawfully related to objective things about the real world and the real body. So that's why the control is just as important as the hallucination. And this whole business of the brain making predictions, well, that is another elaboration of an old idea in psychology about perception as inference. Now, that's how these controlled hallucinations come about, with the brain basically trying to make a Bayesian inference, a best guess about the most likely cause of the sensory signals it gets. And the way it can do that is by continually throwing out predictions about what's out there in the world or in here in the body, and using sensory information to calibrate or update these predictions to minimize prediction error. And that's a way by which the brain can approximate this otherwise intractable process of Bayesian inference. And it provides a theory for what is most closely underpinning or associated with the contents of our consciousness, which would be, in this case, the kind of combined content of all the predictions.
When you're discussing this, it makes me think a bit almost of a existential philosophy, or maybe even some sort of psychoanalysis. It seems like you're implying that always the meaning and the inference is constructed and artificial, something at least we make up, that we create. And then there's some external noumena. Would you go as far as to agree with Kant that the noumena itself is inaccessible? So would it be fair to say, therefore, that consciousness is entirely a construction, a creating of, in kind of the purest sense, semantic meaning of the world?
No, I agree with the first thing, but not the second thing. I agree with Kant that there's this, it's very plausible that there's noumena that's inaccessible. But I don't think the second point about consciousness that you made necessarily follows that consciousness is itself a construction. This might be the one exception to that, going back to this sort of direct access we seem to have to conscious experiences. But I think we can also still be mistaken about things we assume to be necessary or essential or axiomatic and turn out not to be.
Yeah, I mean, according to IIT, you can think of it, even space and time are constructs of the mind. Consciousness itself is not the construct, it's the only thing that truly exists for itself. But space, time, objects, colors, smells, so those are all the notion of self. Some people say it's an illusion. Well, it's much as an illusion as everything else. They're all construct of the mind. Meaning is entirely intrinsically. Within IIT, the meaning, is really the feeling. That's one short expression of it. It's the structure, the way the internal causal structure is, and different experiences have different meanings. And so it's an internalist account of meaning. But it's very much compatible with Immanuel Kant's transcendental approach to philosophy, what we know, what we can know. Ivy, thanks a lot, Anil. As you see, I'm sort of groping with some of these issues, in the first part of our conversation. And so I pushed hard on this idealist physicalism, and it's evolving. I'm thinking about it every day.
Thank you. Thank you. See you again sometime soon.
Namaste.
All right.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.